Hi, welcome back to The Retail Lawyer. So right now I'm going to talk a little bit about OSHA considerations in light of the COVID circumstances. For those of you who follow me on LinkedIn, you'll know that a week or so ago, I posted a short video on the proper removal and disposal of contaminated gloves because everyone's walking around with masks and gloves and they're kind of throwing them on the street, or even when they're throwing them in the garbage, they're not doing it appropriately. So I'm going to take that video and post it on here as well. But I wanted to follow up in a more holistic way in this video segment, where I want to talk about OSHA considerations overall. Now, in terms of the retail industry, it's not a highly regulated industry for purposes of OSHA, which is the Occupational Safety Health Administration or Health Act, depending on how you're using OSHA at the time. So unlike construction or healthcare, which are highly regulated and there's lots of specific rules in place, for other businesses, such as retail or office spaces, there are no rules. And it really comes down to what's reasonable under the circumstances. And so it comes down to what's called a general duty analysis. So Section 5 is the general duty clause of OSHA. And what that talks about is foreseeable risks and foreseeable hazards within the workplace for workers. And the key to keep in mind with that is I use the word worker, not employee. So it's going to cover your actual W-2 employees. It's going to cover independent contractors within your space, and it's going to cover service providers within your space. So if you have a guy who comes in and changes out your water bottle or waters your plants or does your cleaning, you, for purposes of OSHA, are a joint employer for that person and need to take necessary steps to make sure that they are provided a safe work environment. That's a lot to take in when you think about it. So I have a short one sheet. I'm going to try to do this whenever I do a segment where I put a little one sheeter together with some details and some basic information. The videos will have more. The basics and definitions will kind of be on these one sheeters. And so if you want this one sheeter, send me an email at laurabrandesq@gmail.com, or you can private message me through LinkedIn at The Retail Lawyer. And I will send you this one sheeter, which is going to set out for you the general duty clause, the definition specifically. I'm going to explain to you what that means. So what it means is you're going to look at your business and you're going to say, okay, taking retail in mind, right? When my employees in the past came in, I had to worry about slip, trips, and falls. I had to, in my cleaning people, maybe I did some bloodborne pathogen training, and I had some ladder safety training for people who were working in a warehouse or working in a store space, a bricks and mortar location that has very high shelving, and they needed to get on ladders regularly. You feel like visual merchandisers, things like that, right? So you think about your employees, you think about your workers who come in and out of the space, and what are they doing? And how could they possibly get injured within the confines of your physical location? And you would take reasonable measures. So for ladder safety, you would put protocols in place. If you're climbing on a ladder, you need to put signs that there's a ladder coming up so people are aware that there's somebody on a ladder. You need to have a second person holding the ladder, things like that. If you're working in a warehouse and people have to lift heavy boxes, you start to look at what's the weight of the boxes. And OSHA kind of puts this level at 50 pounds. So, and maybe you want to do less than that, but I'm just saying, think about 50 pounds. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, so if the boxes are more than that, I have to teach them how to ergonomically lift it properly. Do they need special equipment like a back belt? Do they need a forklift? Is it a matter that instead of a forklift, can I do 2 people lifting one box, right? So you think about how can I address these safety concerns in a commercially reasonable way? And the way that OSHA breaks it down is there's 3 ways you can do it. And you've heard these terms kind of thrown around since COVID started, right? So personal protective equipment, PPE. We've heard that a few times. So PPE is protective personal equipment. And so for this actually it's the other way, personal protective equipment, you're thinking of things like gloves and masks that we see everybody wearing, right? Then goggles and face shields, which we've been seeing on the news, all the medical people wearing, and aprons and things of that ilk. So think about your workers. Now that you were talking about retail, what are you going to do for your workers who are consumer facing? So will you issue masks to everybody? Because PPE is supposed to be provided at the cost of the employer. So are you providing masks? Are you providing gloves? You need to train people on the proper use of the masks and the gloves. I know that sounds strange, but you do. You can't just give it to them and assume that common sense kicks in, where maybe it does. But the fact of the matter is, under the rules and the guidelines, you actually need to train them and have them sign off that they've been trained on the proper use of the PPE, as well as any other safety trainings that you give them. On top of that, instead of PPE, in addition to, I should say, PPE, you can think about what's called a work control. So I mentioned the issue about the box, right? So a work control for a very heavy box would be to have 2 or 3 employees lift that box. And you give protocols and say, well, you know, if the box weighs over whatever the amount is, then we're going to bring in 2 or 3 people to deal with the box. With the ladder, instead of signs or instead of blocking off an area, you have that second person holding the ladder and warning people away, handing up tools to somebody on the ladder. Those kinds of things. That's called a work control. So you're basically looking at your SOP, your standard operating procedure, and what can you do within that standing operating procedure that doesn't require PPE, or maybe it does in addition to, but that helps limit the risk to your workers on your site. By the way, PPE can be, it all depends on your injuries. So I would recommend, one, you got to think about COVID, right? We got to think about what's realistic with COVID right now, but then also look backwards and go to your insurance carrier, specifically your workers' comp carrier, and get a run for the last year to 3 years of injuries and claims and see what the patterns are. How many times has somebody fallen off of a ladder? How many times somebody gotten electrocuted? How many times has somebody gotten stuck with a needle? And I raised that issue because of the idea of the bathrooms. I think many of you are aware that there was a big hoopla about public use of restrooms at restaurants, and like Starbucks very famously said, anybody can use our bathrooms, they don't need to be a customer. And while that's a very nice sentiment, it creates issues, and it ended up creating issues for Starbucks. So if you go look it up, you're going to find out that there was a lot of OSHA complaints by the employees, because now all of a sudden the bathrooms were being utilized to such frequency that they were gross. They needed to be cleaned more frequently. The employees were put in a position to have to clean them more frequently. They were coming across, unfortunately, in many locations, needles, used needles, different kinds of things that they now were being exposed to bloodborne pathogens, disease, and other things that they didn't deal with before, or they weren't aware of. So now the company's on notice, and they have to get what's called a sharps container, these little red containers, and you put the needles in for safety. They had to and should have done training with the employees on bloodborne pathogens, which is the proper way to clean up after something like that, the dealing of the sharps containers, what kind of cleaning supplies do you need to use, the proper use of those cleaning supplies, like all of that comes into being now because Starbucks was put on notice that their employees were at risk. So any employee who was in the category of ever having to clean a bathroom needed to get that training, and now has to get that training because now the company's on notice. Otherwise, they can be fined. They could even be closed down if the risk is considered strong enough. So it's that kind of thing. So we talked about PPE, which is the gloves, the masks, the goggles, etc. It could be something as a shoe, closed-toe shoes in warehouses, things like that. You have to just use your brain a little bit about common sense and how far that goes about what is going to protect your workers. It doesn't have to be the most expensive option is the right option. It has to be the option that works. So we talked about PPE, we talked about work controls, which is that SOP, the standard operating procedure around a task. And then lastly, there is engineering controls. So engineering controls comes down to mechanics, right? So with that box, the one person lifting it, no good. 2 people lifting it or 3 people lifting it, okay. So that's a work control potentially. But maybe the box is too big even for 3 or 4 people to lift. And then you really need to get a forklift involved. Now you could choose to get the forklift involved earlier in the process, or you can wait until it's absolutely necessary, but that would be a work control. There's less expensive work controls you can think about as well. So for example, if you're a retailer with a bricks and mortar location, maybe you prop open your doors and you have door stoppers. That's actually a work control because it's a stopper so that people don't have to open and close the doors to limit the risk of germs. Maybe it's like you're seeing at the grocery stores right now, that plastic screening around cashiers and point of sale. Maybe it's more phone orders and virtual conferencing with clientele. If you're a higher end, I think that might work actually, where you have your independent shoppers on a video call with the higher end clients, kind of going through the process of this is what's come in this season, this is what do you like, what don't you like, and you kind of do a curbside service or a delivery service. have them try the things on at their home and then bring it back to the store. That might be something that people are considering to limit the risk and exposure of germs, especially if the reports, unfortunately, are true that we might be getting another wave of this. So we have to start thinking about how do we operate and limit risk exposure to these germs? How do we keep business going and keep our employees and our overall workers safe? So that's what OSHA is about. Now keep in mind too, with the training that you do, you don't have to hire and spend lots and lots of money on doing this training. You can do one-on-one with the employees. You can do a room full of trainings with pamphlets and PowerPoint presentations and images that people see, and just document it to the file like you would with any HR situation. I had this training, this is the name of the training, this is the date and time of the training, I received X materials, and yes, here's my signature. And that way you cover yourself and you protect yourself. So keep that in mind. Think about your business, how it operates, and how best to protect your workers. And it's going to help you in terms of your insurance costs because claims will go down. You're going to be able to keep your business open in light of COVID, hopefully. And you're going to prevent yourself from being shut down by OSHA or receiving violations because they can fine you and it can get costly. So you don't want that to be the case. You want to take care of your workers. The best workers are the workers who feel like they're cared for. And you want to do what's right by you. It's good branding for your customers as well. So that's my short, not so short spiel on OSHA. I can go on much more detail if you'd like at some point, but for now, here's a few minutes for you to think about. And again, I have that one-page summary that in a much more abbreviated way tells you everything that I just said. And you're more than welcome to have that. Just give me an email or shoot me a message on LinkedIn. So LinkedIn, The Retail Lawyer, or email laurabrandesq@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to send you that information. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you on the channel again.